Thank you, Monica, for that very generous introduction. I'm conscious of the fact that time is very short now for this session, so I'm going to try and be very, very brief and just raise a few key points, because I'm sure you have questions for my fellow panelists, and I want to leave time for that. Unlike them, I'm not going to be talking about the research that I've done or anybody else has done very much. I'm going to be talking about the research which I think still needs to be done in terms of private security and in particular the transnational role of private security. My presentation is also different from theirs in the sense that I'm going to give you a 10-minute rest from PowerPoint so that your eyes can recover from last night's alcohol. So I want to start by talking about research that's been done on the public police and contrasting it with the research that's been done on private security. Empirical research on the public police, which sought to discover exactly what public police do and how they do it, didn't really begin in earnest until the late 1950s and early 1960s. And there were pioneers in the US, well-known names like William Wesley and Al Reese Jr. and Jerome Skolnick and James Q. Wilson, who pioneered this research in the US. And in the UK, it was Michael Banton and Maureen Kane and Robert Reiner and people of that ilk. And in Australia here, of course, it was our good friend Duncan Chappell and his colleague Paul Wilson, who more or less owned the field for the first 20 years, I think. So what I want to do is just very briefly identify what I see as 6 key variables which have emerged from that 50 or 60 years of research on the public police. This is a rather pretentious thing to try and do, but to try and understand not just what police do, but how they do policing. And the 6 variables that I want to identify here are, first of all, the first variable would be the source of authority for policing, and of course, or what my colleague Clifford Shearing has called the auspices of policing. And of course, in the case of the public police, the source of authority is the state and the law. Second is looking at the legal regime under which policing has to be done, and that concerns the legal powers of the police, the various controls on police activity, legal controls on police activity, issues of governance and accountability, to what extent the police are effectively held accountable and governed in terms of what they do. And as we know, there are problems. There have always been problems there. Thirdly, and very important, especially in the last 20 years, is the occupational culture of the police. This reflects the traditions, and what we've called the policing mentalities that are brought to the policing tasks. So is it considered a militaristic activity? Is it considered a law enforcement activity? Is it considered a crime prevention activity, et cetera, et cetera? So different police organizations have different policing mentalities, and that's related to their occupational culture and shapes it. Fourthly, of course, is the resources that police have available to them to do policing, and that includes human and non-human resources, and of course more recently the emphasis has been on technology and how that's influenced how policing is done. Fifthly is the issue of consent. Of course, most police organizations prefer to police by consent. It's easier, it's less risky to the police themselves and to the community. So one of the issues which researchers have tried to tease out is how police manage to secure consent and obedience to police commands in doing policing. And finally, related to that is the question of legitimacy, and we heard quite a lot about the recent research here in Australia on that yesterday. How legitimate the police are seen to be by those whom they are policing has an impact on almost all of those other variables and is very, very important. So many of these key, and of course there are others, key variables which researchers have identified as essential to understanding how police do policing have had to be reassessed in recent years as policing has moved onto the international stage, as state-sponsored police have moved towards, through globalization, etc., towards the international stage. Now, by comparison, research on private policing has began much later, about 20 years later than research on the public police, and it's been much more limited. There's been many fewer people involved in research on the private police over the last 30 years or so. Beginning about the 1970s, people began to take notice of the private police, particularly its growth, and a lot of the research in the 1970s dealt with counting how many there were, how much they were growing, how much policing they were doing, etc., describing the legal regimes and the regulatory framework within which private policing operate. And of course, in Australia here, my colleague Tim Prensler and Rick Saar have been, again, virtually owners of the field for the last 20 years or so on that topic. In the 1990s, there was growing interest in governance and accountability of private police, the adequacy of training, the integrity of private police, and a broader question as to whose interests they actually represent when they do policing. And it's only in the 2000s, really, that serious empirical ethnographic research on the private police has begun to take place. George Rigakos in Canada, Alison Wakefield in the UK, Rick Saar and Tim Prensler here in Australia have been leaders in that field. And all of this research has been on domestic private security rather than transnational private security. So while systematic empirical research on transnational state-sponsored policing could be said to be in its infancy, and I guess the most recent contribution to that field is Ben Bowling and James Shapticky's book, Global Policing, which I can recommend you to read if you haven't already. It can be said that such research on transnational role of private security has barely begun. There's been a few academics who have begun to write on this subject. I'm thinking of Rita Abrahamson and her colleague Michael Williams in the UK, Bruce Baker. They've done work on the role of private security in Africa and some transnational aspects of that. But this research has so far not been systematic, and it's not been ethnographic. It's not been on the ground, as it were, observing and recording how private police actually do policing. And that's the area that I believe needs to be explored in the coming years and decades. Going back to those 6 key variables that have been identified through the public policing research, we know quite a bit now about the sources of authority for private policing. We know quite a lot about the legal regimes. We know almost nothing about the occupational culture of private security. We know not a lot about the resources that are available to private security and how they use those resources to do policing. We know almost nothing about how private security secure consent to their policing, and we know almost nothing about how legitimate the private police are seen by those whom they police in the countries where they police. So what do we know? I think we can say that with confidence that we know the following things. We know that there's been a massive, rapid expansion and growth of private policing in the last 50 years since the Second World War. We know now, we didn't when we first started doing research on this, that they're not simply private clones of public police. They often think about the whole business of policing quite differently from the public police. That is to say, they have different policing mentalities. They've developed innovative, alternative ways of doing policing, which are possible for them, but not always possible for the public police. because of constitutional and legal constraints. But having said that, we also know that there is almost nothing that the public police do that is not also somewhere, sometime done by private policing organizations somewhere in the world at some time. We know too that they don't rely, and they don't have to rely as much on, as the public police do, on their legal powers, and they don't have to, and they don't resort to the criminal justice system to the extent that the public police do in doing their policing. We know that while private security originated in domestic jurisdictions, private security organizations, both contract and in-house, these days operate transnationally to provide a wide range of policing and security services to an extraordinarily diverse collection of communities and clients. We know that there have always been, as there have been with the public police, issues of effective governance and accountability for private policing provision, and that these challenges have become more complex as private policing has moved onto the international and transnational stage. So that's, in a nutshell, and I've been trying to be quick about it, what we know and what we don't know. I think you've heard a lot from the previous speakers about why we don't know these things, how difficult it is to do research here. So in the interests of time, I'm going to skip that part of my talk. Thank you very much.